It's time to review and reflect on your mock exam results. This, of course, is the mock exam that we took at the beginning of January when we first came back from winter break. And I just want to reiterate to you what I said back then. Treat this for what it is. It is a snapshot of what you could do after just one semester of study in the course. We still have a lot of course left to go, but we're using this as a formative tool to see where we are at this point in time, or rather, where we were 3 or 4 weeks ago when we took this mock exam. Make sure that if you haven't done so yet, you've opened up that Kami assignment in Canvas that has the scoring worksheet, because throughout this interactive lesson, you're going to be asked to enter your results on that scoring worksheet and calculate them. So let's get started. And no better place to begin than with some notes. Let's start with the multiple choice section. Just like the actual AP Lang exam, this mock exam contained 2 reading sets and 3 writing sets of multiple choice questions. A set is just a set of questions belonging to a particular passage. So we had 2 different reading passages and 3 different rough draft writing passages to answer questions about revision on. The most missed reading questions were question 1, which asked about the source of the passage. A lot of you seem to think that this particular passage was taken from a Lakota folk tale, or maybe you just misunderstood what the question was asking. But when it asked about the source of the passage, it was literally asking like, hey, this is an excerpt. What is this excerpt from? And so maybe if you understand the question a little bit better, because clearly this is not a folk tale by any stretch. Another most missed question was question 17. This was the most missed question, and it was a pure reading comprehension question. The question 17 came from that second reading passage, which was difficult to read, but if you missed that question, just work on reading more closely, and hey, maybe you just need to do some more reading outside of class to build up those critical reading chops, because this was just a pure comprehension question. Do you understand what you're reading type question. Question 22 was another most missed question. It asked about a potential counterpoint to an issue. And that's kind of an interesting question because you'd expect to see that on like a writing passage, but here it was on a reading passage asking you which of the following answers would best counter the author's argument. So that's we've studied counter argument before. We've studied that more recently, so hopefully you won't miss that one again. The most missed writing questions were question 25, which asked about the most effective thing to add to an introduction to engage the reader. Question 34, which is a pure vocabulary question, it just asked which of the following words is a better choice for what the author has. And then finally, question 44, which was a sentence function question asking, should this sentence be added? The good news about 44 is that most of you chose no, which was correct, but you chose the wrong no. And so at least you knew that that was a poorly placed sentence and it shouldn't have been there. You just didn't know why it shouldn't be there. All right, it's time to start looking at your results. Head out now to AP Classroom and review your results on the mock exam multiple choice section only. This particular assessment in AP Classroom was titled 2020 Practice Exam 1 MCQ. So that's the one that you're looking for. You'll need to record the number of questions you answered correctly on your scoring worksheet and then calculate that weighted score. After you filled out that first part of the scoring worksheet for your multiple choice results, go ahead and complete the following reflection. Make sure that when you reflect deeply and honestly on your learning. When you're done with reflection activity, go and unpause the video to continue the lesson. Let's continue our notes. Let's go over now the Q1 synthesis essay. This prompt asks you to argue a position on the benefits of privatized space exploration, a really cool topic to write about. I really hated the sources, though. I thought the sources just provided kind of a homogenized set of opinions that were all just one particular viewpoint repeated over and over again. So really not, hope we don't see anything like that on the actual exam. One of the big things I saw with this essay was a lot of students confusing what privatization actually means. You need to understand the difference between private institutions and public institutions. Private institutions are owned and operated and controlled by private individuals, often regulated by things like the government and laws and that sort of thing, but they are owned and operated by individuals. Public institutions are controlled, owned, and operated by the government, which in a democratic society means us. We own that. We pay the tax dollars that fund it. We determine how it's run based on who we elect into office and so on and so forth. So there's a stark difference. They're opposites between private institutions and public institutions. Don't confuse the two. So here are some things that we did well on this Q1 synthesis essay. A lot of us wrote really good appropriate thesis statements. That's not a problem for very many students at all in this essay. You're doing a really good job of referencing specific ideas from at least 3 sources, so we're all hitting the requirement for this essay and the source requirement. And you're doing a good job of fully introducing the authors of the sources. Some of you stopped doing that, so I'd like to remind you to go back to our lessons on synthesis. Make sure you introduce who the source information is coming from, who they are, what their credentials are, or if you don't know their credentials, what publication they're writing for, that sort of thing. That's just a really a good way of demonstrating your sophisticated understanding of a source. Here are some things, though, that we need to work on. These are some issues that I saw come up over and over and over again. First of all, while you are doing a good job of identifying authorship, a lot of you need to be more careful with examining and evaluating that authorship and those sources. A lot of you thought Kevin McCarthy was writing for some journalistic publication and his article was called Testimony Before Congress. No, Kevin McCarthy is a congressman. And so it sounded really weird when you said Kevin McCarthy's article on testimony. It was really bizarre. So pay attention to the bibliography information and the italicized introduction that tells you what the source is. Also, make sure that you're using an effective blend of paraphrase and direct quotation. Since this exam was on your computer, you were able to copy and paste information, and a lot of you went overboard with that and copied sentences and sentences and sentences of text evidence. No, you have to break up your text evidence into a blend of paraphrase and direct quotation so that you're only directly quoting those individual words and individual phrases and maybe sometimes individual clauses that matter, where the wording actually matters. You paraphrase everything else. Okay? Paraphrase everything, only quote those words and phrases where the exact wording really matters. Lastly, things we need to work on: acknowledging the limitations of your argument. That's a really big one that we're going to continue to work on throughout the second semester. A lot of you took a position and stuck with that position and didn't even bother entertaining the idea that your position could be limited in any way, and it came off as very naive. Let's talk about how the Q1 is scored. The Q1 synthesis essay is scored on a scale of 0 to 6 points, and the rubric is broken up into 3 separate rows, each measuring a different set of scoring criteria. Row A evaluates your thesis and is worth 1 point. Row B evaluates your evidence and commentary and is worth 4 points. Row C evaluates the sophistication of your discussion and is worth 1 point. Time now to look at your Q1 synthesis essay results on the mock exam. Head back out to AP Classroom, review your results on that mock exam Q1. This assessment was titled 2020 Practice Exam 1 FRQ Q1. So look for that one in AP Classroom. You need to record your essay score out of a scale of 0 to 6 points in that appropriate box on your scoring worksheet, and then calculate your weighted score. After you finish doing that, if you look in your notes, it'll ask you to go ahead and make a copy of the full AP Lang essays scoring guidelines. You will need to have that copy of those scoring guidelines to complete the following reflection. So make sure that you open that up, make yourself a copy, and save it for your future reference. We're going to be looking back at that document quite often throughout the rest of this semester. Okay, after you've recorded the Q1 score in your scoring worksheet and done your calculations, and after you've opened up and made a copy of the AP Lang scoring guidelines, go ahead and complete the next reflection. It's similar to the previous one. This time you're reflecting on your essay writing and the scores you received on the scoring guidelines rubric. Make sure that you reflect deeply and honestly on your learning. And when you're done with the reflection activity, don't forget to unpause the video to continue the lesson. Let's continue with our notes. The Q2 rhetorical analysis essay. This prompt asked you to analyze the rhetorical choices that Claire Booth Luce uses in her 1941 address, The Role of American Women in Wartime. I gave you this prompt ahead of time. You guys were able to prepare, and I could tell that a lot of you did a lot of preparation for this, so excellent job there. Didn't really see any problems with understanding what she was talking about here, and so all in all, these were some pretty good scores. So here are some things particularly that we are doing well. First of all, you guys are doing a good job writing appropriate thesis statements for the Q2. You're doing a really good job of identifying your rhetorical techniques by giving them noun phrase names. You're also doing a good job of pulling appropriate text evidence. Here, however, are some things that we need to work on, some recurring issues that I saw in a number of different papers. First of all, once again, using an effective blend of paraphrase and direct quotation. Once again, since this was done online, a lot of you copied and pasted quotations that were way too long. And this is especially bad on the Q2 because you're actually analyzing language. And when you have a quotation that's like 50 words long, how are you going to analyze all of that? And so what ends up happening is you pull a quotation that's 50, 100 words long, and you refer to bits and pieces of it, but you don't say which bits and pieces you're referring to. You just expect the reader to know what you're talking about. So that's a really kind of like a clumsy way of performing analysis. So once again, make sure that you're only directly quoting those words and phrases that are important, and you paraphrase everything else. Next, we need to keep working on explaining our rhetorical obstacles. This has been a big one throughout the whole year. So yes, good job finding the rhetorical obstacle, good job identifying it, but you can't really get credit for it in your analysis. It's not really helping your analysis unless you explain where the heck it's coming from. So a lot of you pointed out kind of the social gap between Luce and her audience, but you didn't really explain where that social gap came from. A lot of you also just kind of casually threw in that her audience, wouldn't know how to behave during wartime or something like that. Well, explain that. Why wouldn't they? I'm honestly not sure that you can even say that, considering this is an audience that just 20 years prior was going through World War I. So, be careful. Make sure that you can explain your rhetorical obstacles. Lastly, here's the biggest one. Connecting the intended effects of whatever rhetorical choice you're talking about to the writer's purpose, back to the writer's purpose. So many of you wrote some really good rhetorical analysis paragraphs, but it wasn't a rhetorical analysis essay because you were just analyzing, here's this technique, here's its effect, here's this technique, here's its effect. When you're not, what you need to be doing is saying, here's this effect, and here's how this effect is helping achieve the purpose, because that ties it into what the author's trying to do. And as you're going to see on the scoring guidelines that College Board publishes, if you can't connect those rhetorical choices back to the writer's purpose in some way, you don't get credit for that whole analysis. And so it can really make or break your score on the College Board scoring guidelines. So let's get back to doing that. The Q2 is scored on the exact same scale and using the exact same 3 rows as the Q1. You've got your thesis row, your evidence and commentary row, and your sophistication row. It looks very similar with just some different language because instead of arguing now, you're analyzing. Time now to take a look at your Q2 results on the mock exam. Head back out to AP Classroom, open up, find your results on that Q2 by looking at the assessment called 2020 Practice Exam 1 FRQ, Q2 and Q3. I know it's a long name. The Q2, by the way, was the first question on that assessment. Remember, that was a combined assessment with the Q2 and Q3 in it. Once you've tracked down your essay, go and record your essay score in the appropriate box in your scoring worksheet and calculate that weighted score. Very good. Once you've entered the appropriate information on your scoring worksheet, go ahead and complete the next reflection. Make sure that you continue to reflect deeply and honestly on your learning. And when you're finished with the reflection activity, make sure you unpause the video to continue the lesson. Let's finish up our notes. The Q3 argument essay. This prompt asked you to argue a position on the advisability of a 48-hour cell phone ban for college orientations. And I got to say, I was really impressed with the results on this essay. The first Q3 that we wrote back in December, November, on the ethics of incentivized charity was not very good. Not a lot of really good arguments made on that topic, but this one was really good, really cohesive for the most part. Here are some things that we're doing really well on the Q3. Continuing to write appropriate thesis statements that are responding directly to the prompt. Good job there. You guys did a much better job this time on focusing your body paragraphs along specific lines of reasoning. I did have a handful of students whose body paragraphs were kind of all arguing the same thing, but for the most part, a lot of you found different lines of reasoning for each of your body paragraphs that were clearly relating back to your primary claim in your thesis. So that was very good. Lastly, good job of using concrete examples to illustrate your reasoning. So a handful of essays that were always speaking in the abstract and the general and the vague, and their arguments weren't that good, but the vast majority of you are making sure to bring in concrete examples to illustrate what the heck you're talking about, which makes those arguments so much stronger. Here are some things that we need to work on with the Q3, some things I saw over and over again. First of all, making sure that you connect all of your lines of reasoning back to your thesis. While I did see a number of students doing this, there was still a lot that weren't. And so again, we had something similar to what we had with the Q2, where it was like, okay, this is a series of paragraphs, not an essay, not an extended argument. It's a series of individual arguments. So make sure at the end of every body paragraph that you are tying your reasoning back in to your thesis. In this case, tying all of that great reasoning back into, okay, why does this matter at college orientation? So many of you, the only time you mentioned college orientation was the intro and the conclusion. And everything in between was just like general arguments about cell phones good, cell phones bad, that sort of thing. So make sure that you are connecting everything back to that thesis. Next, another really big one, we need to keep working on carefully weighing the issue at hand and really figuring out what it all boils down to. I wasn't joking before. A lot of essays didn't really mention college orientation that much. They just started talking about cell phones and the effects of cell phones. But really, the point here is trying to figure out whether at college orientation, whether having cell phones, whether permitting the freshmen from having cell phones or not having cell phones is more beneficial or less beneficial to achieving the goal of what the goal is for college orientation, right? Virtually none of you sat down and started to figure out, okay, what is the goal of college orientation? And that's where you have to start with this argument. What is the goal of college education? What is it trying to, orientation? What is it trying to help these incoming freshmen do? And then putting yes cell phones, no cell phones to that test. Do they help or hurt achieve those ends? Next, we need to keep working on acknowledging the limitations of our arguments. A lot of you, once again, took just a really strong point of view and never looked at either side, and it created this very myopic argument that was relatively weak, not necessarily an invalid or totally weak argument, but it was weaker than it could have been had you just kind of acknowledged where your arguments come up short. Lastly, this was a little bizarre. I had a number of papers that equivocated on the issue. I think they were trying to create a counter-argument paragraph, but it ended up being this really bizarre kind of paragraph at the end of their body that basically undid all of the good arguing they did on their position stated in the thesis. So when writing a counter-argument paragraph, we're focusing on this now, you should never start that paragraph with however. When you start a counter-argument paragraph with however signals a rebuttal, right? And so what all of these students did is by starting their paragraph with however is they basically wrote a rebuttal paragraph to their own essay. Don't do that. We only bring in the viewpoints of opposing arguments so that we can acknowledge the limitations of our own argument or refute those opposing arguments. We don't bring in opposing viewpoints just to have opposing viewpoints. That undoes our argument, that makes our argument weaker. So make sure that you're not equivocating when asked to develop a position on something as specific as this. This Q3 argument essay is scored on the same scale, that 0 to 6 point scale, and uses the same 3 rows as the Q1 and Q2. At this time, let's go ahead and take a look at your scores on the Q3. It's the second question on the 2020 Practice Exam 1 FRQ, Q2, and Q3 assessment in AP Classroom. Go ahead and record this final score in the appropriate box in your scoring worksheet and calculate that weighted score. All right, once you've done entering that information on your scoring worksheet, go and complete this final reflection activity. Make sure you're still reflecting deeply and honestly on your learning. And when you're finished with this reflection, go ahead and unpause the video to finish up the lesson. So we're basically done here, but I just wanted to remind you to finish filling out your scoring worksheet if you haven't done so already. All that should be left at this point is doing a little bit of math and then consulting the table in the lower right-hand corner of that scoring worksheet to figure out what your final exam score is. Remember, AP exam scores are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Passing is 3. But a lot of universities these days, especially the more selective universities, are only giving credit for 4s or 5s. I know that here in the state of Texas, Texas has now mandated that all state universities give credit for 3s. However, a lot of those universities will only give elective credit for 3s and not actual English credits for 3s. So, 3 is still outstanding. 3 means that you are ready to take on advanced college coursework. Advanced college composition. It means you don't need to take freshman composition. Your university may still ask you to, but that's what a 3 means. A 2 means that you are right where you're supposed to be. It means that you are ready to start freshman composition. So, don't think of 2 so much as failing, so much as, hey, you are right where you need to be at the end of high school, and you're ready to enter freshman composition, right where you need to be. Also, make sure you read that little blurb above the table about how the composite score ranges are found each year. This is giving you a good estimate of your exam score, but those composite ranges change every year slightly. So if you're kind of toward the lower end or upper end of one of those ranges right now, it could change. You could very well slip from a high 3 into a low 4, or a low 3 into a high 2, just depending on how those composite score ranges are calculated after this year's exam. But there's no way we can predict what that will be. All right, and once you've finished filling out your scoring worksheet, doing all the calculations, make sure that you've submitted it to the Canvas assignment, and that is the end of this lesson.